Because you did invent these categories and this method of compartmentalization and discrimination, and because your society actively treats people according to these categories, so-called black and so-called white, they exist as real things in these terms. Because you act like any of this is real, because you act like it's real, so now you have created very different experiences for people, which means different histories for people, different communities, different identities, and so forth, all on the basis of your fabricated categories. So we have to make that distinction. In reality, in actual reality, so-called black and so-called white do not exist among humankind. But because you treat them like they do, because you classify human beings this way, now you force this to become an experiential reality for people. You understand? Now it is an experience that people have in this world, have in their lives, in their minds, in their psyches, in their identities, all based on a completely warped and entirely unjustifiable framework. See, you created this problem for mankind. You created this problem for mankind. Because before you created this problem, people just came from different places. People just had different physical characteristics. People had different backgrounds, different heritage, different lineage, different cultures, and so forth. Different languages, different customs, different practices, different beliefs, and what have you. And human beings all around the world just acknowledge the obvious reality that people who come from different places and come from different environments and come from different climates, they have their own qualities. And generally speaking, it was inconsequential to most people how people looked. That wasn't considered a particularly interesting aspect of any qawm, of any folk, of any nation, of any people. I mean, do you understand, as a so-called racial category, as an identity, as a thing that means something, that's supposed to mean something about who you are and about who you're supposed to be loyal to and about what group you belong to, the so-called concept of whiteness is only about 350, 400 years old. That's it. That's the whole lifespan of this supposedly fundamental, self-evident category of human beings. 350 years, maybe 400 years or so. I mean, in the full scope, in the full sweep of recorded human history, that's nothing. I mean, yes, of course, like I said, people would notice lighter or darker complexion. They would notice that for as far back as people had lighter or darker complexion and eyes to see it with. But it wasn't a source of identity. It wasn't a source of categorization or a reason for categorization. And certainly not anything hierarchical. It was not a racial, so-called racial concept. Like there was no pan-European white race or something. That didn't exist. It was just an incidental feature, a superficial feature, believed by most people to be climate-related or location-related or so forth. See, you didn't even come up with this foolishness until your so-called enlightenment. That's when you came up with this foolishness, when you got enlightened. You had this racial epiphany, and it just happened to coincide with colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. What a coincidence. Before that, Europeans didn't think of themselves as white. Not once, not ever. The English thought of themselves as English. The Irish thought of themselves as Irish. The Germans thought of themselves as German, and the French thought of themselves as French, and so forth. There was no white brotherhood, no shared white culture. They despised each other. They detested each other. Genuinely, deeply, violently, generationally, they despised each other. There was no such thing as pan-European solidarity. There was no white fraternity. That never existed in history. There was centuries upon centuries of tribal hatred, border raiding, religious slaughter, dynastic warfare, and the systematic exploitation of every neighboring group whenever the opportunity presented itself. The 100 Years' War, that was England and France on and off for over a century, for 100 years. The 30 Years' War, it was so the 30 Years' War was so destructive that it killed somewhere between 25% to 40% of the entire population of Germany, what's now Germany. Europeans doing that to other Europeans, so-called white people doing that to other so-called white people. The War of the Roses, butchering each other for a crown, for the throne. The English occupation of Ireland. That happened centuries before they ever went to Africa or anywhere else. With the same logic of extraction and displacement and engineered famine, they perfected that on the Irish people, white people, so-called. White people being colonized by so-called white people. There's your Aryan brotherhood. So let's get clear. Let's get clear on what Europe actually was before the concept of whiteness was invented. because it is a completely invented concept. For most of recorded European history, the overwhelming majority of Europeans lived in abysmal squalor. Absolutely abysmal squalor. You can't imagine the conditions. You would recognize it today as extreme poverty if it even exists anywhere today. I'm talking about a level of destitution that's difficult to comprehend from a modern point of view, from a modern vantage point. Medieval European peasants, and peasants was most of them, the vast majority, about 4 out of every 5 people was a peasant. They lived in a one-room hut, dirt floors. They shared it with their livestock, literally. Their animals slept in the same space that they slept in for warmth, sleeping with your goats and sleeping with your pigs. That's your history. The average life expectancy at birth was in the mid-30s. Half of all children died before the age of 5. 1 in 5 women died in childbirth. Famine was absolutely common. It was routine. The Great Famine of the early 14th century killed 10 to 15% of all of Europe's entire population. Then the Black Death came, the bubonic plague. And that took out another third, or some say up to a half of the population of Europe. This is the conditions that they came from. So understand the real history of the people that we're talking about here. Okay, there was never in history some kind of block of so-called white unity or white fraternity. Nobody ever thought like that. Nobody had anything even remotely like that in their minds. And during all that time, by the way, the church, your church, they owned up to a third of all the land in Europe. The aristocracy owned almost everything else. And the peasants worked the land. They couldn't leave the land. They had to pay tithes to the church. They had to pay taxes to the feudal lord. They couldn't leave the land. They couldn't even get married without permission. They were literally legally bound to the soil, not metaphorically, legally bound. You were a serf. You were a serf. You came with the property. You understand? You came with the property. If the land was sold, you were sold with it. That's your history. You weren't human beings. You were farm tools. You were instruments. Instruments for other people who you would later classify as white, but who did not see you and who did not treat you in any way whatsoever as equals. They didn't even treat you as human beings. They didn't treat you as people. White on white subjugation. White on white predation. That's the history of Europe. That's the history of Europe. White on white violence. White on white war, conflict, and strife. And if you're paying attention, that's Europe's future too. That's their future too. That's where they're going. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that not much at all has changed. Even after they started calling themselves so-called white instead of calling themselves English, or calling themselves white instead of French or German or what have you. The same system is essentially what you have right now in America. That's the feudal system. Europe's great civilizational achievement, the feudal system, before they went out and colonized everyone else. And that's still what you have today. In fact, it's the only organizational approach that you have to your societies, centuries later. Now, I've talked before about how in Europe, across Europe, before Christianity, these people were pagans. They worshiped the jinn. They had relationships with the jinn, with the shayateen. That's not me saying so. This is the historical record. This is the historical record. The Germanic tribes, Odin, Thor, they had blood sacrifices. Yes, blood sacrifices. They did that. They did animals mostly, but they also did human sacrifices, and that is documented. They sacrificed human beings. The Norse people too. Seasonal ritual offerings, that included humans. The Vikings and whatnot. We all know they used to hurl old people off of the mountaintops. When they got too old, they'd throw them off a cliff. You had the Druids among the Celtic people. They had these large wicker structures into which they would put human beings, and they would set them on fire, burn them alive as offerings. Oh, these were brutal people. The devils that they worshiped commanded them to do all sorts of heinous things. This is the history. The days of the week in English still carry the names of their pagan gods, their Germanic false gods. Wednesday is Woden's day. Thursday is Thor's day for Thor. Friday is Frigg's day. Saturday is the day for Saturn. Your calendar is an artifact of your mushrik satanic history. You can't deny it. And Christianity, when it came to Europe, it did not actually displace any of this. It adapted to it, or rather it got adapted by it. European Christianity is very foreign to what they practice in the region where Nabi Isa, where Prophet Jesus actually lived. I mean, calling their religion Christianity is like saying that Pat Boone's version of Little Richard songs sounds the same. You still had idol worship. You still had polytheism, praying to Mary, praying to saints and whatnot. Your pagan festivals got Christian names. Your pagan sacred sites got churches built on top of them. And the folk traditions, the charms, the hexes, the magical beliefs, the nature worship and whatnot, all of this persisted for centuries underneath the official religion. And in fact, they still do persist. You have to take note of that. It's very important to take note of that. I told you before, people talk about China, people talk about India or Egypt or what have you, but Europe probably has the longest continuous congruent culture on the earth. They have been incredibly resistant to changing or developing. It's astonishing. Whatever comes to them becomes like them, or else they'll fight tooth and nail against it. This is a culture that cannot be reformed. It cannot be reformed. It can only be papered over. That's all they've ever done. They rebrand, but they don't change. There's only ever been cosmetic changes to that culture. And this is extremely important for you to understand, because it's a serious mistake to think that so-called Western civilization is a modern thing. People think of it like that. People think of it like that, as if Europeans just suddenly sprang forth as a totally changed people after the Dark Ages. They sprang forth as these great enlightened, rational, scientific, humanitarian thinkers or something out of nowhere. They like to partition their history like that. They like to partition their history. There was the before and there's the after. That's this sort of partitioning. That was then, this is now. Let's not talk about the then. But no, understand, this is an ancient people. This is an ancient people, and they are more resistant to change and more resistant to reform and rehabilitation than any other people on the face of this earth. You think industrialization changed them? Like, as soon as they got machines and as soon as they got gunpowder, somehow that caused a sudden, rapid maturation process, a refinement and advancement in their character? No, not at all. You know how like the West, the term the West is synonymous with modernity, as if some highly advanced, intelligent life forms, some extraterrestrial life forms landed in Europe in the 1800s, and they have no other history before that. No, this is a people, the European people, this is a people who are ancient and whose ways and whose culture has remained absolutely consistent for the last 10,000 years. I'm telling you, things that they were doing and ways that they were acting 10,000 years ago, they were doing those same things 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, and this morning. They're pre-modern in the modern age. It's 2026, but they're still prehistoric. I'm telling you, in their minds. So you understand, I'm talking about the origins of the culture, the origins of the system that you're all in over there in America right now. The origins and the originators. And that's the culture and that's the system that all of you have absorbed, that all of you have been affected and infected by. No matter where you sit in the social and economic hierarchy of that country, it doesn't matter. Yes, it doesn't matter. You're seeing the world through a prehistoric lens. And it's not even the lens of your own original culture, the original lens of your own actual people. If you're a so-called minority in America, a member of the global majority in America,